All right, it is 4 o'clock, and this is time for the Great War Discussion Group. I'm Charlie Van Way, your moderator, and our speaker for today is Jerry Phillips, who is going to educate us on the American intervention in Russia following World War I from 1918 to 1920. Jerry, you're on.
Thank you, Charlie. Welcome, everyone. As Charlie mentioned, our topic will be the American intervention in Russia in 1918-1920. I like to grab you with an interesting photograph to start off. This is a poor corporal of the 339th Infantry who is in the middle of the Russian winter. And if you'll note, the temperature reached 50 below that day. And I researched Corporal Hearn, and I'm happy to say he survived the war, lived into, I believe, his 70s. He passed in the 60s in Florida. He was wise. He moved back to his home state. Well, these are my normal disclaimers. You know what they are. I would also make the disclaimer that I'm a recreational historian and amateur. And I'm going to describe to you a complex set of circumstances and events today, which will be significantly condensed in its story and in its telling. So I'll probably miss some things you're looking for, but you just have to make decisions on what you present in this type of format. And this photograph shows the 27th Infantry Regiment in Vladivostok, Siberia. So Americans were in North Russia and in Siberia. And today, I want to lead you through this chronology. I'm going to talk about the Allied intervention. America played a relatively small part in terms of personnel in the intervention. So I'll talk to you about the big picture. We'll talk about the events in Russia, a revolution and a civil war. The Americans are going to get right in the middle of it. We'll talk about the decision to intervene. It was made, I would argue, at two levels, one at the European level, and then the Americans had to decide what they wanted to do, which was a difficult decision. Then we will go into the two expeditionary forces, North Russia and Siberia. These are the two areas where America committed land troops and a few naval vessels. And then we'll talk about the aftermath. What were the results and what were the long-term repercussions, if any? The intervention, the big picture, this was a multinational affair. And about 18 countries involved, a total of 250,000 troops. The British actually sent a sizable naval squadron to the Baltic Sea. And the Americans committed about 15,000 U.S. land troops and 2 ships. The picture you see here are the commanding officers of the Siberian expedition. I'll use my pointer here. This is General Graves. This is the commander of the Americans in Siberia. This is General Otani. He's the commander of the Japanese. As you will note in this picture, there are at least there are representatives of 6 countries that form the Allied forces in Siberia. Here's a map that gives you the broad view of the total intervention. We talked about North Russia. The U.S. was involved there. We talked about Siberia to your right. The U.S. was involved there. There's the Baltic British naval squadron of 164 ships that were in the Baltic Sea during the intervention. There was a southern Russian intervention that was led primarily by the French and the Greeks. It was short-lived and didn't accomplish its objectives. There was a very interesting interventions in South Caucasus, small British force that actually you could argue was the most successful. And the events in Russia, what provoked the intervention? In a short period of time, 12 months, Russia went from being an imperial monarchy to a communist state for the most part. And March of 1917, revolution broke out. The Tsar abdicated. A provisional government was in place for a short time. It was fragile. The Bolsheviks, the communists, began to take over control of the two big cities of Petrograd and Moscow. And it turned into a civil war because there were forces aligned with the Tsar or had similar ideological beliefs as the Tsar, and they began to resist the Bolshevik takeover. Those would be the White Guard or the White Russians, if you may have heard of them. But the bottom line is Imperial Russia was over in 9 months. And this produced a strategic shift for the Allies to have to deal with. Russia was once an ally, now it's perceived as a threat. At least it was a considerable worry to the Allies. The Bolsheviks, as they progressively gained power, the communists progressively gained power, they tend to align with the Germans. Vladimir Lenin here owed his existence in Russia to the Germans because they helped him get out of exile in Switzerland. And he aligned with the Germans, reached an informal truce with the Germans. So the fighting stopped on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front collapses. By March of 1918, they have a formal treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and that ended Russia's participation in the war, certainly on the Allied side. This allowed the Germans to reposition forces to the Western Front. So it was quite a change in the strategy of the war in a very brief time. Before I go further, I'm going to just take a moment to digress and explain some of these parties that are in Russia. And I'm going to talk to you in context of how the Americans would perceive them or relate to them. We have the Bolsheviks. Bolshevik is a word in Russian that means majority. These are Marxist revolutionaries. They have good leadership, Lenin, Trotsky, and others. When the Americans get there, they will have the momentum in the Civil War. They will simply be better organized, they'll be ideologically unified, and they will be difficult to deal with. They will be the enemy to the Americans, but only unofficially. As you will learn later, the Americans were not sent to Russia to fight anybody. That will be different with the British and the French, but keep that in mind. We'll talk about that some more. There will be the White Russians. It's not clear how they even got that name, White Russians. There are different theories on that, but for our purposes, they are anti-Bolsheviks. They're primarily former Tsarists, although they are not terribly unified in all their ideologies. They tend to have fractured and weak leadership. They are principally an ally on paper. In North Russia, they will prove to be not terribly reliable allies, but they will fight with the Americans and the other forces at times. Then we come to the Cossacks, an interesting group of people. They are farmer settlers that are populated throughout Russia. They have their own identity. They tend to be militarized. They will have their own units, military units. They will serve within essentially all the various Russian armies. You'll find some in the Bolshevik, you'll find some in the White Russians, but they will generally act in a self-interested manner. In North Russia, at times they will be helpful to the Americans who fight there. In Siberia, they will often be a threat. They will be a problem the Americans will have to deal with. We'll explain that a little bit later. And now I want to talk about the Czech Legion. They were on that earlier map. I should have mentioned them, but they were placed all the way across Russia. They're a very interesting group, complicated history to some extent, but for our purpose, they're Czech and Slovak soldiers who were formerly of the Austro-Hungarian army. There's 40 to 70,000 of them. That is how the historians talk about them. They are located throughout Russia. They are spread across the Trans-Siberian Railroad because they're trying to get out of Russia through the east, through Vladivostok. They do not like the Germans. The Germans do not care for them, nor do the Austrians. They cannot go west. So they're stuck in this place in Russia, and they're trying to go east and get out. They're quite cohesive, well armed, as you can see from this photograph here, and they're very effective fighters. They will control parts of the Trans-Siberian Railroad while they're there for a period of about 2 years. They're important to the Allies because the Allies want to help them. They want to get them out of Russia, bring them back west, and get them into the war on the Western Front or have them reestablish the Eastern Front. So they will be both an actor in the intervention and a cause of the intervention. Now let's talk about what the Allies, the Western Allies, are up to. And this is principally Britain and France. They are driving the conversation for the most part. They perceive Bolshevik communism in Russia as a serious threat to them. The British worry that it might spread to India. The French worry it might spread to Germany. They all worry it might spread to their labor unions. They want to fight the Bolsheviks. That will be a reason they go into Russia. Not so with the Americans, you'll learn later. As you can see here, Winston Churchill was quite prominent in his opinion that the British and the Allies generally should fight the Russians, the Bolsheviks. I mentioned the Czech Legion. All of the Allies think the Czech Legion needs help, and they want to help them in some fashion. In the early part of the war, the Allies had given the Russians a lot of stuff, a lot of supplies, war material. That stuff, those stores of equipment, tend to be in Murmansk in North Russia, and they tend to be in Vladivostok in the Far East. The Allies are worried that the Germans are going to grab it or the Bolsheviks are going to grab it. Some estimates value these stores at over $1 billion in value. So it's important. The Germans are making moves because they've been freed up from the Eastern Front. There are rumors they're in Finland. That's debatable, but still it animates the conversation. They are making moves into the Ukraine. Perhaps they're going to the Southern Caucasus oil fields. So it's a concern. All of the Western Allies have commercial interest in Russia. Big companies like International Harvester has factories there. More significantly, the Americans are owed over $300 million in loans. The British and French are owed somewhere from $1 to $2 billion. The Bolsheviks say they're not going to repay those loans. So these are the things that are animated the conversation as to whether there should be an intervention or not. But the question then goes to the Supreme War Council in Versailles. This is a group of senior military leaders and sometimes political leaders will join the conversation. They meet regularly. They were formed in 1917, and they're trying to coordinate all the Allied activity in the war. They will make the decision there should be an Allied intervention into Russia militarily. They will make certain assumptions when they make this decision. They will believe that that time, and they're making this decision in spring of 1918. They believe the Bolsheviks are relatively weak and unpopular. They also believe the Russians would be pleased with an Allied intervention, and they think generally the intervention will be easy. Now, these will all prove to be wrong, but we can't engage in too much anachronistic thinking about this because they did have some reasons to believe these things. Events were happening very fast in Russia. Their intelligence was not always up to date. But there was also there was an attitude that the Russians aren't very good at anything and that they would be easy to work with and the Bolsheviks would be easy to defeat. And then we come to America. President Wilson, as he said here, he's sweating blood over the decision. This is what he told Colonel House, his trusted advisor. The Allies are seriously pressuring him to send military forces, American military forces, to Russia. He generally doesn't want to do it. He wants to focus on Germany. Remember, this is mid-1918. We're just now getting troops to Germany. Also, his advisors, as well as him, are not impressed by the Allies' plans. They don't think the Allies have feasible plans in Russia. His advisors are divided to make his decision harder. Secretary of State here, he is lukewarm in favor of the intervention, mainly for diplomatic reasons. Secretary of War Newton Baker here is against it. However, he's a loyal supporter of Wilson and he'll do what Wilson wants, but he advises he's not in favor of an intervention. Peyton March, the Army Chief of Staff, expressly recommends against military intervention by the United States in Russia. Wilson ultimately wants to be a good ally, so he accedes to an intervention on a limited basis. And that's when he produces his Aide Mémoire. I hope you all had a chance to read it. It's quite a remarkable piece of work. But he sat down at his typewriter on 17 June and cranked this thing out. And it says many things, sometimes contradictory. But he starts out and he says, it is the clear and fixed judgment of the government of the United States that military intervention in Russia would add to the present sad confusion rather than help. He then says it cannot therefore take part in such intervention or sanction it in principle. You would think with that statement, he's not going. But later on in the document, he says military action is admissible in Russia to help the Czechs and to steady any efforts at self-government or self-defense in which the Russians themselves may be willing to accept assistance. He will also go on to say that they can help guard the stores, they can render humanitarian services. He does not say in this aide memoir anything about fighting any Russians, particularly Bolsheviks. This document will be the only orders, as far as I can tell, that the American military commanders got in Russia. This is the orders they're going to have to understand to try to accomplish their mission as it's defined here. It will add a lot of confusion to the case. So, America is going to go to Russia. It's going to go to going to have the North Russian Expeditionary Forces and the Siberian Expedition Forces. But the decision that Wilson has made is in July. Army forces will get to Siberia in August. Army forces will get to North Russia in September. Before that, however, the Navy is already there. The U.S. Navy has sent ships in early 1918. They arrive March, April timeframe. It's the Olympia in Murmansk. It's the Brooklyn in Vladivostok. These are naval warships. They're there to show the flag and protect the port. However, the Olympia allowed 100 sailors and Marines to get off the ship, go into port, and presumably guard the stores. But while they were there, a number of sailors joined up with other Allied forces, got on rail cars with machine guns, went down the railway looking for Bolsheviks. And they got involved in fighting in early August 1918. And they got themselves kind of in a jam. They got several miles away from Archangel, where they landed, and they had to have some assistance in getting themselves out of the jam. And these are sailors here that seem to be pretty happy they're back. Now we'll focus exclusively on the North Russian campaign. You can see the statement here by one of its participants. This is Lieutenant John Cudahy. He wrote a biography, a memoir of his events, of his experience in North Russia. He became a diplomat and a politician, and he's highly critical of North Russia expedition. But here he presents his feeling of how it was when he arrived in Archangel. I had to look up this word. I didn't even know what presentiment was. It's a intuitive feeling of foreboding, which is probably the appropriate word, because the Army will going to land in 4 September. In 30 days, they're going to experience 150 casualties, 17 combat deaths, and at least 66 flu deaths. So they're going to be in trouble before they get started. Who is there? Well, in North Russia, it's going to be the 339th Infantry Regiment. These are the classical polar bears. You've heard of the polar bear expedition. They make up a large portion of that group. This is a National Army unit. It was organized August 1917. It's part of the Custer Division, the 85th Division. They're out of Michigan. They're trained in Michigan. Many of the recruits are from Michigan or Wisconsin, so many of them are from Detroit. They sometimes call Detroit's own. Some writers on the topic make a big deal that many of their immigrants are Slavic, Russian, Poles. Perhaps they speak the language, can deal with the Russians when they get there. I'm not sure if that's the case. And some writers even think they were picked because they're acclimated to the cold weather. I've learned later that's probably not true. I would take that out now if I had this to do over. They will be assisted by the 310th Engineering Battalion. These folks will do a lot of work in North Russia. I'm going to show you a 7 or 8 minute film a little bit later, and you'll get to see them at work under very difficult conditions. The 339th and the 310th will be aided by railroad companies, 2 of them. You will learn that in Russia, the only way to get around is by railroad. The roads are bad. The trails are bad. If you don't have railroads, you don't go anywhere. So they have to have railroad companies there to keep them running. And there will be 2 medical companies, ambulance and hospital. They will do exceptional work under very difficult circumstances. The North Russia expedition gets off to a bad start. First of all, these men are told they're going to go to England and then to France. While in England, they're told, no, you're not going to France, you're going to Russia. They are not prepared for Russia. They're not trained for it. They do get the pleasure of a lecture from Ernest Shackleton, the famous polar explorer. He presumably told them how they could survive in very difficult weather conditions. He also gave them the Shackleton boot, which is a specialized boot he developed for polar exploration. I'm sure it's very good for that, but the soldiers would find it a hindrance rather than a help, and you'll hear more about that. They will travel to Russia on 3 ships. 2 of them will be very bad. They're old cargo ships. They're dirty. They're rat infested. They have very poor ventilation, and the flu will break out very severely on 2 of these ships. 1 ship will be totally free of the flu. They will have to eat bad food. They will complain about the British food throughout the North Russia expedition. They had to eat tripe on the ship, which I understand is made from the lining of cows' stomachs. It may be nutritious, but it isn't appetizing. They will also get inadequate weapons. The Americans decide they will be given the American-made, contract-made Mosin-Nagant rifle that the Americans had contracted with the Russians to make. They will not be able to use their weapons that they trained with, and they will complain about the Mosin-Nagant in a number of letters and diaries that it was an inadequate weapon. When they get to Russia, they will also be confronted with command problems. The Supreme Allied Council has decided that in North Russia, the British will control everything. They will be the total commander of all Allied forces. That in and of itself is not a problem. Unity of command is not a problem. What turned out to be a problem is the man they selected to be the commander, Frederick Poole. He was an old colonial officer. He had actually retired before the war, came back after the war. He had had service in South Africa, India, and he had been a liaison officer in Russia for 2 years, so they thought he knew something. He was not the guy for the job. He started off by preparing a very ambitious plan to fight the Bolsheviks. He believed for some reason that he was the spearhead of a much larger Russian invasion to come. He would immediately integrate American soldiers into offensive attacks, offensive actions against the Bolsheviks, notwithstanding whatever Woodrow Wilson wanted. However, he soon wore out his welcome. As Anna Reid points out here, he was not a brilliant soldier. She goes on to say he was even a worse politician. He irritated the Allies, particularly the Russian allies, and finally his superiors. He would be placed on leave in October 1918. However, it would be his plan the Allies and the Americans would have to live with, which would produce some problems. Here's the American commander of the 339th Infantry Regiment, George Stewart. He is put in a horribly difficult position. He was a regular Army soldier. He had won the Medal of Honor in the Philippines when he saved a guy from drowning. He had spent 2 years in Alaska, so they thought he knew something about cold weather. He's primarily a quartermaster engineer type. He's not an infantry officer. Before going to Russia, he got no briefing. He got really no preparation. When he gets there, he has no say in strategy or how the Americans are used. This is all determined by the British down to the very low levels. However, he is quite passive. He sits back in his warm quarters while the men are out freezing. And the soldiers that served under him grew to dislike him intensely, and he will be quite severely criticized for his failure to support his troops after the intervention. He will stay in the army, but as a matter of fact, Russia ends his career effectively. Just a bad position to be in. Things will get better on the command side. In November 1918, this guy, William Ironside, British general, is going to take command of North Russia. The Americans like him. They call him Big Bill. And as you can see here, he was a bit surprised he was given this position. And he was told by the chief of the general staff here that you're prepared for a winter campaign. He was told that in September. He will arrive there late October, November. He will replace Poole. He will do things Poole and Stewart won't. He will go to the fronts. He will deal with soldiers. He will talk to them. He'll get the lay of the land. He ultimately, during his tour there, will determine this is a waste of time. We need to get out of North Russia. And ultimately, he will plan and supervise the departure of all Allied troops from North Russia. And there's a great story about him relating to World War II. I don't have time for it, but if you ask me later, I'll tell you. Let's talk about Poole's plan. This is a plan the Americans had to live with in North Russia. All the Allies did. Again, I'm focusing on the Americans, and no slight to the Allies because they're right there with the Americans, but I'm focusing on the Americans and what they did. Anthony Beaver, well-known British historian in World War II and other areas, called this plan, said it was based on a map fantasy. That's the best explanation I've been able to read. Poole said the Allies are going to hit the ground running. They're going to land in Archangel. They're going to move rapidly to the center of Russia. That's about 300 or 400 miles. They want to take the cities of Vologda and Kotlas. I'll show you a map in a minute. He then believes the Czechs, who are moving east to get out through Vladivostok, are going to reverse and come back west and join up with his force. He also believes the White Russians are going to be in a position to raise 3 divisions of soldiers. The total group of them, his plan is, will then combine forces and move west another 500 miles to reestablish the Eastern Front, take Petrograd, and there's also some evidence that he thought he could also take Moscow with this force. All of his plans would prove totally ineffective, and it wouldn't work at all. And you can see it here. It's difficult to get a good map of North Russia's operations, but I found this one and I think it'll work. And I'm going to use my pointer here, so I apologize if it moves around. But the Americans are going to be spread out over 15,000 square miles, as are other Allied forces. There's going to be a company of them here right along this front in Onega. There's going to be another 2 to 4 companies in this general area here. This is the Archangel to Vologda Railway. There's also a river here that isn't on the map. It's called the Yemsa River. It's spelled it begins with an E, but it's pronounced Yemsa, I understand. There's soldiers along that river. There are soldiers throughout 3 companies of them down here along the Vaga River. And there will be a company over here. There's a town up here called Penega. This is the Penega front. So they're spread out all in these areas. They're placed in this position very quickly after arriving in Archangel. Within 6 weeks or so, they are in these positions, maybe 2 months. These arcs are the furthest penetration the Allied forces ever made into North Russia. And Poole's plan is they were going to move rapidly from Archangel to Vologda, from Archangel to Kotlas. They were going to take those rapidly. Never got there. They are fighting in very difficult lands, boreal forest, swamps. The rivers freeze in November. They can't travel down the rivers. And as Napoleon says, in Russia, there are no roads, only areas. They found that out. There are no good roads there. And they did not have adequate guides or maps to get them around. It was a difficult environment. Briefly, the type of fighting they would engage in would be generally small-scale fights relative to the Western Front. It's what today you would call irregular or counterinsurgency warfare. They might take a town or a village, and they would have to give it up because they couldn't sustain their position, and then the Bolsheviks would just take it back. They tried to take the offensive throughout early 1918 and did engage in various fights with the Bolsheviks. This is the Americans and other allies with them. Other allies are British, French, Canadian, Poles, Serbians, and some Italians. By the beginning of 1919, the Bolsheviks are going to gain considerable strength. Red Army units are going to start to show up. They're going to force the Allies to be on the defensive pretty continually until they leave. And the Allies will leave between June, roughly, of 1919 and November of 1919. They will consistently be outnumbered and outgunned. By the time the Americans leave, the Red Army is believed to have 600,000 soldiers in North Russia. The Allies will never have more, as a fighting group, more than 15 or 20,000 at best. With this, I'm going to show you the film. Let's hope it works. Thank you to Bart. Bart put me onto this film. I do have some misinformation here. I say it's between November and January, February. Actually, there's some in October and there's some a little later too, but don't worry about it. It's all in the winter in Russia. You can't tell. It's working. Thank you, Bart. I'm going to narrate this really quickly because it's not a talkie. But this is the railway station out of Archangel. This is the northern terminus of the Archangel-Vologda Railway. This was probably taken in November 1918. I'm guessing. Information from the National Archives doesn't tell me precisely. Now we know when this is taken. This is taken in November 1918. This is blockhouse number 1 along the railway, and these are men of the 310th Engineering Battalion. They're working on the blockhouse. And here you can get a good view of what's called the northern boreal forest. Not the most pleasant place to be in winter. This is blockhouse number 2. Again, men of the 310th Engineering Battalion. And men would live in this during the winter and go on patrols. This was filmed a little later. This is in April, early April 1919. Again, they're near the railway, about 100 miles south of Archangel, where this was taken. They're building dugouts. This is a sad photo. One of these gentlemen is Lloyd Connor. This was taken April 8th. He will drown June 8th. He will not make it home. This is White Russian artillery attacking Bolshevik positions. This too would be along the Vologda Railway, off the railway some distance, but about 100 miles from Archangel. This is White Russian artillery. These are some of the White Russian soldiers that were allied with the Western Allies. These are men of 310th Engineering Battalion getting a little food. These are white Russian soldiers who were in something called a hybrid unit called the British Legion. They had British commanders, and the British was trying to train them and get them into some fighting condition. These are British soldiers going to reinforce an American position some distance down the railway. This is blockhouse number 3. That's all I know. That's all the National Archives had in their information. This is a signal corpsman of the 339th Infantry stringing a telegraph wire. This is along the Vladivostok Archangel Railway. This is a man of or soldier of 339th. The next few minutes, you're going to see the furthest they got along the railway. This is about 130 miles south of Archangel, and this is as far as they got. These photos were probably taken January, February 1919, middle of winter. These are Russian laborers working on the railroad. If you'll notice, there's 3 or 4 guys standing around, 2 working. Nothing ever changes. These are men of the 339th. They're down the Vologda Archangel Railway, about 130 miles, about as far as I got. You'll see the snow conditions, and you'll see this one poor guy fall into a big hole in a minute. And these are difficult enough conditions just doing your daily job, but they had to fight in these conditions. The Bolsheviks were pretty good at wearing white tunics and sneaking up on them. And I'm just going to show about 30 seconds more of this. But here's a patrol of the 339th. I'm not sure if this is realistic or if it's staged, but you can certainly get an idea of the conditions they had to work in. We know who these men are. One is a Sergeant Major Reed, and there's a Private Galloway and a Private Metcalf. I was able to track Galloway and Metcalf. They survived the war, moved to the south after the war. Sergeant Major Reed, I haven't been able to track him yet. But I'm probably going to stop right now. I think you get a feel for what it was like there. And that brings us, we're about to wrap up the North Russian expedition. But I wanted to talk about this one series of battles. There was a tipping point. And this is an instance where I had to make my own map, so I apologize for that, but it'll do our purposes today. On 19 January, we'll say about 300 Allied forces, including 260 Americans, were attacked by 1,200 Bolsheviks. Sneak attack. Happened early in the morning. The lead platoon was 47 men. It suffered 40 casualties within the first hour or two of fighting. 20 of them will be dead, 20 of them will be severely wounded. This was the beginning of a long series of retreats from this area called Ninjigora up to this town, to this town, to Shinkursk, which was a major town in this area, by the way, back to Shigovria, up to Vistovka. Finally, it stopped 11 days later at Tisa. During this period of time, 11 days, about at most 1,000 Allied soldiers were chased by 3,000 to 5,000 Bolsheviks. They would have to travel at night. They would have to pull their wounded on sleds. This is where the Shackleton boots failed them. They couldn't get traction, so they threw their boots off and they ran in their stocking feet. They would try to put on multiple layers of wool socks, but they're moving through heavy snow at night in 20 to 40 degree weather, trying to escape the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks would flatten every town as they came to them. They had heavy artillery, the Allies did not. This poor Canadian artillery battery had 2 guns. One of them they had to leave behind because their horses died on them. So it was a terrible 11-day flight from constant danger. They had to carry their wounded. Men died along the way because they could not get adequate medical care. And this was a total disaster, to put it bluntly. It infuriated General Ironside. He didn't like the fact that the poor Americans got stuck down here this far. He, in fact, was at this position 18 January, the day before this attack. He was actually there and was very uncomfortable with their position, but thought it was part of Poole's plan, so he was hesitant to do anything. He was upset at his intelligence officers in Shinkursk, who didn't know about the size and strength of the Bolshevik force. So this proved to be somewhat of a turning point, because the Americans are going to get some relief up here in Tisa on 30 January. They're still going to have to stay there for a couple months, but things are going to change. Because on February 19, Wilson goes into Newton Baker's office and says, get them out of Russia. So he sends the order February 19 to come home. When Shinkursk, I showed you that town, when it failed, that shook people up. That was a worry that if the Russians took it, there wasn't much hope. The U.S. are going to be out of North Russia by April and June. Between February, April, and June, they're still going to be fighting. They're going to have to hold off attacks, but eventually they will get out April and June. The last Allied troops will be out by November 1919. Total casualties, this is the best numbers I could come up with, is you got 144 killed in action, you got 300 wounded, and you got 100 non-combat deaths. The majority of those are from the flu. So for an intervention that was not intended to involve fighting by the Americans, actually involved a lot of fighting. So that ends the North Russian expedition. So let's talk about how they're remembered, because this is a significant part of it. The Polar Bear Association was formed in 1922. It was formed by soldiers of the 339th and the 310th Engineers. They went about very seriously over a period of years, going to Russia, spending extensive time there and recovering the bodies of soldiers there. They recovered 107. Had them back within about 10 years. 24 are still there. They buried a number of them in the Whitechapel Cemetery in Troy, Michigan. This is the Polar Bear Monument. Here you can see a photo of the American dead coming back on hearses after they were recovered. And the Polar Bear Association exists today. They have a lot of good information on there. If you're interested in it, you can get an entire list of all the men who served in the 339th and the 310th Engineers there. But now we're going to Siberia. We got another fight to deal with. This will be a different experience. These will be regular Army soldiers, 27th Infantry, 31st, and volunteers from the 8th Division. There will be some other units there, but it will primarily be these three units that are going to provide the fighting force there. As I mentioned, this is a different experience. First of all, the American policymakers tended to think Siberia was more important than North Russia, principally because of the problems they were having with Russians and Japanese. The Americans are going to have about 8,000 troops there. That will change as soldiers do transition in and out. These are regular Army soldiers. They will have very good leadership. They will have American weapons, which will make a difference. They will have Springfields, BARs, and Lewis machine guns. They'll be there longer than the North Russian expedition lasted. They'll be there about 18 months. Their casualties will be fewer, but still substantial. And here are members of the 31st Infantry near Vladivostok. Here's their commander, Major General William S. Graves. He is highly regarded, has the confidence of all his superiors. The president knows who he is. Peyton March knows who he is. Secretary of War knows who he is. They will always have his back, and he is competent. Interesting story. In late July, he is in Palo Alto planning to go to France to fight with the 8th Division. He is commander of the 8th Division. He gets a sudden and emergency telegram that says, get on a train, not a plane, train to Kansas City. He leaves immediately. He arrives August 2nd at Union Station. They were to meet at the Hotel Baltimore, but they didn't have time. So Newton Baker hands him a copy of the Aide Mémoire and says, watch your step. You will be walking on eggs loaded with dynamite. He says, God bless you and goodbye. And he said, if you got anybody to blame, you can blame me because this is going to be a really difficult assignment. When he gets to Siberia, he will not place U.S. troops under any other Allied commander's supervision. He will try to strictly follow the limitations of the Aide Mémoire. He will read it over and over and try to implement it. He will be the subject of false information from allies who will not like what he's trying to do. Even the State Department at times will try to undermine him. And after the war, he will be accused of being soft on communists because he would not fight the communists unless attacked because he thought that was his orders under the Aide Mémoire. No one went to Russia and really had a good time. It didn't help anyone's career. So what's he going to find there? Well, first of all, he's going to find a bunch of alleged allies. Japanese are going to have at least 70,000 soldiers there. The Czech Legion is in the area. They are still about 1,000, 1,500 miles away. We'll cover them in a minute. The Poles have a goodly number. Canadians, Italians, British have some small forces. The Americans only have 8,000 soldiers, about 5% of the total Allied soldiers there. This is a real early effort at coalition warfare, and it doesn't work well. As the commander of the Canadians said, everyone assumes that everyone distrusts everyone else. And let's amplify on that. Here are his allies. We have Alexander Kolchak. He is the commander when the Americans arrive in Siberia of the White Guard, of the White Russians. He's trying to fight the Bolsheviks. He is a Navy officer. He's not an Army officer. He is not too successful in fighting the Bolsheviks. He will become unreliable to the Czechs. The Czechs eventually turn him over to a local partisan group who then turn him over to the Bolsheviks. He will be tried, convicted, and the next day executed. He will be replaced by Grigory Semyonov. He is a Siberian Cossack. He is the Ottoman of the Cossacks, means he's the military leader. He is illiterate. He is incredibly brutal. His group of Cossacks will attack civilians. They will destroy towns. They will steal, rape, anything possible. The Americans have a difficult time dealing with them, and they are allies, theoretically. At times, he will challenge U.S. forces. We'll talk about one of those. Then they have to deal with General Atani. He is competent fellow. He is an experienced Japanese soldier, but he's there to pursue Japan's interests. Japan wants Siberia, or a good chunk of it. At times, he will play nice with the Americans. At times, he will spread a great deal of anti-American propaganda. There will be incidents, small incidents, where the Cossacks and the Japanese will butt heads with the Americans. A few soldiers will get killed or taken prisoner, and then things will cool down. But that's the life that General Graves has there. So let's talk more generally about the Siberian experience for these soldiers. It will not be like North Russia. They're going to patrol the Trans-Siberian Railway, and they're going to patrol the Sushin mines just north of Vladivostok. These are critical commercial areas. You have to keep the railroad running in Siberia. You can't get anywhere without the railroad. The mines are coal mines. They fuel Western Russia. They're going to try to suppress brutality. I've mentioned the Cossacks, but everyone in the Russian Civil War is brutal. The White Russians, the Bolsheviks, the partisans, they all kill civilians wantonly. The Americans will guard POWs, as you see in this photograph. There will be a number of German and Austro-Hungarian POWs in Siberia. They're going to defend themselves from Bolsheviks, partisans, bandits, anyone that shoots at them, and they have to be careful because anyone could be a problem. They will do a lot of garrison work, construction, maintenance, and the like, and they'll provide support to the Czech Legion as they can and to the railway service, which is an interesting topic. There's a bunch of civilians in Siberia during this intervention. One is the Russian Railway Service Corps. They have uniforms. They wear army uniforms. They carry weapons. They come under fire, but they're civilian contractors that were hired by the army to run the Trans-Siberian Railway. They have their own story. They were there 2 years. They kept the railway running. The Russians simply didn't have the expertise or the motivation to do it. These guys did. They did quite a substantial amount of work. The American army is going to try to help them as necessary. And the sad thing is, after the war, they wanted recognition as veterans, and they were denied because they were contractors. They didn't get recognition until the 70s. There'll be other American civilian organizations there, the American Red Cross, the YMCA, Knights of Columbus, and so forth. And they will try to make life better for the civilians. You see the Red Cross nurses here in Manchuria. And they will try to make life better for the American soldier as well. I mentioned the railroads. The primary means of transport in Siberia is the railroad, and it is the way these armies projected military power. The main forces all had these armored trains you see on the left. This is a Czech armored train. They stole it from the Russians. But the Bolsheviks had armored trains, and as well as did the White Russians. The Americans are going to travel on these troop trains, and they're going to live on them at times. That's going to be their quarters when they're located, stretched across Siberia. And here we have a map. Well, I'll give you and I'm going to use my pointer again. Hope this doesn't, it's not too obnoxious. They're going to land in Vladivostok right here. They're going to start patrolling and trying to control this portion of the Trans-Siberian Railway. They're also going to go over here to a place called Chita, and there they're going to try to control that station. And the furthest the Americans will get will be over into this area in this unpronounceable word, and they will be not quite to Lake Baikal. The Czech Legion will control this area up here to Irkutsk. They want to move on east, but there are tunnels here, and the Bolsheviks are blocking their movement. So they have to clear out the Bolsheviks first. But the only way you get around in Russia is through these railways. The Chinese Eastern Railway, and Americans will be down here in China in Harbin trying to control things. I'm going to talk to you about two incidents. One at Romanovka, right here, just outside Vladivostok by about 30 miles, and another one, Polsovskaya, that is way over here about 1,200 miles. The rail distance between Vladivostok and Irkutsk is about 1,413 miles. This is a long way, and you had to have your train to move here. So let's move on to Romanovka. This is one of the sadder events in the Siberian experience. On 25 June, there was a miscommunication, and 2 guards at the camp left their position because they had finished their watch, but their replacements did not appear for whatever reason. This allowed an encampment of 72 men of Alpha Company of the 35th Infantry. They were asleep in their tents. 300 Bolsheviks snuck into the camp and attacked them, shot them in their tents. 19 were killed almost immediately. 5 died of their wounds a little bit later, and they suffered 25 wounded as well who survived. The remaining men were able to fight them off, and eventually they got some reinforcements. But this was the worst day of the Americans in Siberia in terms of those killed by a sneak attack of Bolshevik partisans. They learned a couple things here. One is they found some of the dead partisans, and they were civilians, villagers that they had been buying produce from and thought they were friendly. They learned that nobody is friendly in Russia. The other thing they learned is that sometimes they had to clean out the Bolsheviks. The following month, 5 divisions of the 31st Infantry Regiment are going to go through the Sushin Valley and kill 500 Bolsheviks without losing a man. That was to protect the coal mines. And here we have this sad story. These people, this is William Roberts of Holstead, Kansas, just outside Wichita. He was a guard inside the camp that was probably the first one to get killed, or certainly one of the first ones to get killed. Then we go to Polsovskaya. This happened in January 1920. This is an interesting story. The soldiers are bivouacked in their train cars. Carl Robbins here is a sergeant in the 27th Infantry. They have been stationed there for some period of time because Carl has a Russian girlfriend who tells them on the 9th of January, the rumors are the Cossacks are going to bring an armored train into town in the early morning, and they're going to shoot everything up, including the Americans. So Paul Kendall here, an enterprising young lieutenant who would rise to the rank of general in World War II, command the 88th Division in Italy in World War II. Kendall says, okay, we'll be ready for him. So he prepares his men. So at 2 a.m. on 10 January, the Cossack armored train rides into town, comes up alongside the Americans, and starts shooting it up. Kendall's people are ready, so they return fire. One American is killed in the firefight. Carl Robbins climbs onto the engine of the armored train, throws a grenade into the firebox. The explosion mortally wounds him, but it damages the train. The train then backs out of the town, goes about a mile or so down the river, or down the track, before the engine plays out from the damage. The Americans are following it, shooting at it. They end up killing about 8 or 9 of the Cossacks. They capture 40, and they capture a general. And the general is an interesting guy. The bottom line is, this caused a bit of a diplomatic stir. Your allies are shooting one another. So the Japanese sided with the Cossacks. The Americans are livid, and they were forced to give the train and the general back. The general's name is Nicholas Theodore Bogomolets. He is interesting because in 1941, he is in Hollywood, California. He is an advisor to movies on military matters, and even acts a bit, but he's also a cobbler. He fixes shoes for the stars. Paul Kendall, a general, runs into him and meets him in 1941. Golowitz would stay in the United States. He died, I think he was 79. He died in 1951. But it's just amazing how these people end up. But the important thing of that battle is that after it occurred, the word went to the American soldiers to get out of Siberia. They were to pull back to Vladivostok immediately. The civilian organizations were told to get out. And by April 1, General Graves and all the American soldiers were out of Siberia. A little bit later, about 50,000 Czech troops are going to be able to get out of Siberia. 35,000 of them were going to be carried in 13 ships the Americans provided. And other Czechs will get out through other Allied shipping. The British and French will be out in November. The Japanese don't want to leave. They want Siberia. They're going to hang around till 1922. And that's the end of the Siberian experience for the Americans. So let me run through the references really fast. I'm almost on time here. If you want to read about the North Russia experience, James Carl Nelson's book here is a good book. The second book, Willett's book, is a decent book. It covers both the North Russia and the Siberian experience, has some interesting information about the general and others. If you want to read about the bigger campaign or the bigger intervention, A Nasty Little War, We'll Do It, by Anna Reid. That's a recent book within the last 3 or 4 years. If you want a quick read of a pamphlet, about 80 pages, it's John House and Daniel Curzon. They put together the Russian expedition pamphlet for the centennial in 2017. You want to read about the decision to intervene, it's George Kennan's excellent book. Spends 400 pages on just the intervention. The Czech Legion is discussed in Dreams of a Great Small Nation. Here's John Cudahy's book. This is his memoir, very caustic on the intervention. Here's William Graves's memoir from the intervention. His is pretty straightforward. He just tells you what he did and why he did it. And then Anthony Beaver has a very good book on the Russian Revolution, came out a couple of years ago. So this is some good references if you want to read them. So let's talk about the results. Well, the stores that they were sent in to secure, they did not secure. The stores were gone by the time they got there. The Czech Legion that they were sent in to help, they did help. They escaped. It's not clear how much the Allies' intervention actually helped the Czechs, but it is clear that the Allies' assistance through shipping got them out. So I think the intervention did help the Czechs to some degree. If you're going into Russia to fight the Bolsheviks, you totally failed. They prevailed. They established the communist USSR in 1922, excuse me. If you went in to help the White Russians, you totally failed. They were brutally suppressed. An estimated 30,000 White Russians were executed because the Bolsheviks thought they helped the Allies. It has been argued the Baltic fleets present helped establish Estonia and Latvia their independence. And that is a plausible argument because they did provide artillery support when Estonia and Latvia were fighting both Bolsheviks and Freikorps people from the Germans. That's another story too. It appears the U.S. troops were the first to introduce the so-called Spanish flu to North Russia. They certainly brought it there. There's a couple books that talk about it and believe that this is the vector that got it into North Russia. And it resulted in thousands of deaths. The North Russians really had no immunity to it. That's all I know. The U.S. soldiers, under very difficult conditions, performed amazingly well. And they were just placed in a position of incredible hardship, difficult political, military situation, and they did as well as could be expected. And here's Peyton March, who thought the idea was pretty bad from the beginning, but he points out here almost immediately after the forces had reached their theaters of operations, he said, events had changed, making the whole thing complete failure. He was never for it. He didn't like it before or afterwards. So why was it a failure if it was? Which it was. Well, the U.S. Army had a report of North Russia. I don't think they commented on Siberia. But they said, one, there were inadequate forces. You didn't have the troops. There was a lack of clear aims, and there was friction between the allies. I didn't mention this, but the British and the Americans in North Russia did not get along. They had very different military cultures. They had very different military styles. And there was constant friction between them on various, sometimes petty levels, sometimes more significant levels. But it was a problem. This first attempt at coalition warfare needed a lot more refinement. Nelson has a little different twist. He says there were clear aims for the intervention. The problem was the British had one aim and the Americans had another. It is clear the British wanted to fight the Bolsheviks, the Americans didn't. That did lead to problems, most specifically in Siberia, because the British generals in Siberia were very critical of General Graves. So what do you make of all this? Well, there's different views. This is controversial. This is the debate that continues. Winston Churchill in 1954 at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. said, if I had been properly supported in 1919, I think we might have strangled Bolshevism in its cradle. But everybody just turned up their hands. So to him, it was always a lost opportunity. I have my opinion. I don't think the American forces could have beaten the Bolsheviks. They didn't. I don't think the American or the Allied forces could have beaten them at that time. They were too busy fighting a war with Germany. Didn't have the resources. But maybe I'm wrong. Did it poison U.S.-Russian relations? Here you have Nikita Khrushchev in 1962 pointing out during the Cold War that never have any of our soldiers been on American soil, but your soldiers were on Russian soil. They always mentioned the invasion by the Americans during the intervention. The Russians used this for anti-American propaganda throughout the Cold War, and they generally didn't mention the other allies. They generally only mentioned the Americans, who, as you've seen, sent a fairly small force. Newton Baker called the thing a strange collateral adventure, essentially caused by the great catastrophe of the Great War. He said things like this happen when the world is trying to deal with this enormous conflict called World War I. I leave it to you to have your own opinions. Everyone has an opinion on this. It can be controversial. Thank you very much for your time. That will wrap it up. I did it, I think, in about 67 minutes. I leave you with these two thoughts of Otto von Bismarck and that famous philosopher William Goldman in The Princess Bride that says, never get involved in a land war nation. So I leave you with that. I hope you enjoyed it, learned a little bit. Charlie, back to you. Thank you for all your help, Charlie. You, Bart, and Mike do an excellent job.
Very good. Thank you, Jerry. I was fascinated by your citing of John Cudahy. The Cudahy family was a very wealthy family and has graduates all through the Ivy League. John Cudahy was a Harvard graduate, class of 1910, which explains why he used words that nobody else could understand. He subsequently became an ambassador to Poland right before it got overrun by the Germans. Then he became ambassador to Belgium and Luxembourg before they became overrun with by the Germans. And I think at that point, the State Department probably decided that 3 times was enough, counting the Russian expedition. And he kind of fell into at least political obscurity, although he did go on to be he had become a prominent real estate developer, and he actually died in 1943 being thrown from a horse on his extensive estates outside of Milwaukee. Did I mention that the Cudahys were an extremely wealthy family? In any way, so just a kind of a sidelight to your excellent presentation. Any other questions or comments from anybody? Bruce Hubbard, do you have any thoughts?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is I cannot blame American troops for objecting to being fed tripe. I have tasted it and regard it as one of the most noxious substances known to mankind. Quite appalling stuff, but it's horrible and it's just dreadful. So I can't blame them at all for deciding they didn't want to eat that.
Tripe as a food is so bad that it became a slang term in the 20s and 30s for nonsense. You know, so and so was giving an argument, but it was just all tripe, kind of thing. All right. Anybody else have any thoughts or comments? Our next,
Jerry, I had one quick question. So you said it was like a close to 100% failure to recover the military supplies that they went to secure. Where did they go? Did the Bolsheviks take them away?
In North Russia, the Bolsheviks put it on barges and sent it down the river before they got there. The substantial portion of it. The White Russians stole it, and we're not sure what they did with it. This is Russia. They're trying to survive under very difficult circumstances, so they take what they can to survive on. I'm not being offensive to the Russians. It was very difficult times. So they would take it and use it any way they could. In Vladivostok, I think some of it was still on the docks. So some of that probably was preserved or used for some constructive purposes. But that wasn't their real concern. They were worried about the Murmansk stores because they thought the Germans were going to grab them, as well as the Bolsheviks. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, it does. Hey, I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
And the Navy guys presumably were on railways trying to track down some of the stores that were taken. They didn't recover any, but presumably that's one of the reasons why they were going deep into Russia when they weren't supposed to.
it has been a real pleasure